Picture this. The year is 586 BCE, and the most sacred building on earth is about to be destroyed forever. Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, built with cedar and gold, filled with the presence of the living God, stands surrounded by Babylonian armies, ready to tear it down, stone by stone. In our world, they succeeded, and the Jewish people were scattered to the winds for over 2,000 years. But what if that night had ended differently? What if the God of Abraham had intervened one final time, and Israel never went into exile at all? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Tonight, we enter a world where the temple never fell, where Jewish kings continued ruling in Jerusalem, and where the entire course of human history took a completely different path. This is the story of the Israel that could have been. Chapter 1. The Golden Kingdom. The morning sun rises over Jerusalem in the year 620 BCE, casting golden light across the most beautiful city in the ancient world. King Josiah walks through the temple courts, watching priests prepare the daily sacrifices as they have for over 300 years. The smell of burning incense fills the air, and the sound of Levites singing echoes off marble walls covered in pure gold. This is the kingdom of Judah at its absolute peak. Under Josiah's rule, idol worship has been destroyed, the Torah has been rediscovered, and God's people are following his laws like never before. The temple that Solomon built stands as the center of the world, where heaven touches earth through sacrificial smoke and priestly prayers. But Josiah doesn't know that Babylon is rising in the east. He doesn't know that a young prince named Nebuchadnezzar is already planning to conquer every nation from Egypt to Persia. And he certainly doesn't know that the prophet Jeremiah is about to deliver the most terrifying message in Jewish history. In our timeline, Jeremiah would spend 40 years warning that Jerusalem would be destroyed and the people taken into exile. He would be hated, thrown into prison, and left for dead in a muddy pit. But his prophecies would all come true when Babylon's armies finally broke through Jerusalem's walls and burned everything to the ground. The stage is set for the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history. The question is, what if God had decided to write a different ending to this story? Chapter 2. The night. Everything changed. It's July 18th, 586 BCE, and Jerusalem has been under siege for 18 months. Inside the city walls, people are so hungry they're eating their own children. Outside the walls, Babylonian soldiers are building massive ramps of dirt and stone, getting ready to climb over and destroy everything the Jewish people hold sacred. King Zedekiah stands on the palace roof, looking out at thousands of enemy campfires surrounding his city. He knows tomorrow will bring the final assault. He knows the temple will be burned, the people will be killed or taken as slaves, and the kingdom of David will end forever. In the temple, the high priest gathers the remaining priests for one last sacrifice. They know that by tomorrow night, these sacred walls will be rubble, and they'll either be dead or marching in chains toward Babylon. The Ark of the Covenant has already been hidden away where the Babylonians will never find it. At midnight, Nebuchadnezzar gives his final orders. At sunrise, his armies will attack from every direction at once. The siege engines will break down the gates, the soldiers will pour through the streets, and Jerusalem will burn until nothing remains but ash and memories. But what if that sunrise never came? What if something happened in the darkness that changed everything? What if the prophet Jeremiah, who had spent 40 years predicting this disaster, fell on his knees and begged God for one final miracle? In our timeline, July 19th, 586 BCE became the darkest day in Jewish history. But in the world we're about to explore, it became the day that saved the Jewish people forever. Chapter 3. The Divine Intervention. Just before dawn on July 19th, 586 BCE, something impossible happens. A plague sweeps through the Babylonian camp with supernatural speed, killing thousands of soldiers in their sleep. It's just like when God destroyed the Assyrian army outside Jerusalem a century earlier, striking down 185,000 men in a single night. Nebuchadnezzar wakes to find his officers dead in their tents and his soldiers lying motionless around cold campfires. The few survivors are already running back toward Babylon, screaming about the curse of the Jewish God. Within hours, the most powerful army in the world has been reduced to scattered groups of terrified refugees. Inside Jerusalem, the watchmen on the walls can't believe what they're seeing. The enemy camps are silent. The siege engines stand empty. The great army that was about to destroy their city is melting away like snow in the desert sun. Jeremiah, who had spent his entire life prophesying doom, walks through the temple courts in shock. God has heard his desperate prayer and chosen mercy instead of judgment. The temple still stands, the people are still free, and the kingdom of David continues for another generation. But this miracle creates a completely different world. Without exile, the Jewish people never developed the portable religion of synagogues and scrolls. Without dispersion, they never spread their beliefs across the Roman Empire. Without the trauma of losing everything, they never write the Babylonian Talmud that would guide Jewish law for centuries. The butterfly effect of this one supernatural intervention will reshape human history in ways that nobody could possibly imagine. Chapter 4. The Unbroken Chain. 500 years pass, and Solomon's temple still stands exactly where it was built. The golden altar still burns with daily sacrifices. The priests still wear the same sacred garments, and the Holy of Holies still holds the Ark of the Covenant that Moses placed there centuries ago. Without exile, Jewish identity develops in completely different ways. Instead of becoming the people of the book who carry their faith in portable scrolls, they remain the people of the temple whose entire religion revolves around one sacred place. The Levitical priesthood maintains unbroken traditions passed down from Aaron himself. The Davidic dynasty continues ruling from Jerusalem, producing king after king for over 1,000 years. There's no Babylonian captivity, no Persian return, no Greek persecution, and no Roman destruction, just an unbroken chain of Jewish kings ruling God's people in the Promised Land. But this creates unexpected problems. Without the challenge of maintaining faith in foreign lands, Judaism never develops the intellectual flexibility that made it survive dispersion. Without persecution, Jewish identity becomes tied to land and temple rather than to law and learning. When Alexander the Great marches toward Jerusalem in 332 BCE, he doesn't find a small Persian province, but a thriving independent kingdom. The Jewish priests who meet him outside the city gates represent a religion that has never been conquered, never been exiled, and never learned to adapt to foreign rule. The collision between Greek culture and this uncompromised temple religion creates sparks that will ignite the ancient world in ways our timeline never experienced. Chapter 5: The Crossroads of Empires. Alexander the Great stands outside Jerusalem in 332 BCE, but this isn't the small city that submitted to him in our timeline. This is the capital of a powerful kingdom that has resisted every empire for centuries. The Jewish high priest who comes out to meet him represents not a conquered people, but a proud nation that has never bowed to foreign gods. The conversation between Alexander and the high priest changes the course of Western civilization. Instead of easily conquering Palestine, Alexander finds himself negotiating with a people who have divine protection, proven by their survival against Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. Their temple still stands, their God still fights for them, and their kingdom remains unbroken. Greek philosophy encounters Jewish monotheism not through scattered diaspora communities, but through direct contact with an intact temple system. The Greeks are fascinated by Jewish sacrificial rituals, priestly wisdom, and the claim that their God dwells in a physical building. Some Greek philosophers convert to Judaism and become temple priests themselves. Others try to prove that Jewish beliefs are just primitive versions of Greek ideas. The intellectual debates in Jerusalem's schools create new forms of both. Jewish and Greek thought that never existed in our timeline. When Alexander dies and his empire splits apart, the Jewish kingdom maintains its independence by playing the Greek successor states against each other. They ally with Egypt against Syria, then with Syria against Egypt, always keeping their temples safe and their people free. But the greatest test is still coming. Roman legions are marching east, and they've never met a people they couldn't conquer, or a god they couldn't add to their pantheon. The collision between Rome and an undefeated Jewish kingdom will determine whether monotheism survives or disappears from human history. Chapter 6: The Temple That Never Fell. For over 800 years now, Solomon's temple has stood without interruption as the beating heart of Jewish civilization. Every morning brings the same sacrificial smoke. Every evening, the same priestly prayers. Every Sabbath, the same holy rituals that have connected earth to heaven since the time of Moses. The priests who serve in this temple carry knowledge that was lost in our timeline when Babylon burned everything down. They know the true pronunciation of God's ineffable name, passed down in whispered secrets from high priest to high priest. They know the exact recipes for sacred incense and anointing oil that made the temple smell like paradise itself. In hidden chambers beneath the temple floor, they guard scrolls written by prophets whose names were forgotten when Jerusalem fell in our timeline. These texts contain alternative versions of biblical stories, prophecies that never came true because exile never happened, and mystical knowledge about angels and divine mysteries that mainstream Judaism lost forever. The temple's continuous operation has created a completely different kind of Judaism. Instead of rabbis debating law in academies, priest scholars develop theology through ritual practice. Instead of portable synagogues in every town, the entire Jewish world revolves around one sacred center that never moves and never changes. Jewish holidays are celebrated not through symbolic remembrance, but through actual temple ceremonies that use the original vessels, the original altar, and the original Holy of Holies. Yom Kippur isn't just a day of prayer and fasting. It's the day when the high priest actually enters God's presence and emerges to announce that the nation's sins have been forgiven for another year. But this unbroken tradition creates theological problems that exiled Judaism never had to face. What happens when ancient laws clash with changing times? What happens when the outside world challenges beliefs that have never been tested by persecution or dispersion? Chapter 7. The Christianity that wasn't Jesus of Nazareth begins his ministry in 30 CE, but he enters a world where the temple still dominates Jewish life and the priesthood still controls access to God. His message about a new covenant and a spiritual temple falls on ears that have never experienced the trauma of losing the physical temple. The Jesus of this timeline doesn't cleanse a corrupt temple that will soon be destroyed. He confronts a thriving temple system that has operated successfully for over 1,000 years. His prophecies about the temple's destruction never come true because God never allows it to happen. Early Christians struggle to explain how Jesus can be the ultimate sacrifice when daily sacrifices continue in Jerusalem. They wrestle with whether Gentile converts need to bring offerings to the temple or whether faith in Jesus is enough. The relationship between Christianity and Judaism remains much closer because the temple provides a physical connection they both share. The Apostle Paul never develops his theology of the church as God's new temple because the old temple never stops functioning. Christian communities form around synagogues that serve as local gathering places, while the Jerusalem temple remains the ultimate center of worship for both Jews and Jewish Christians. When Roman armies approach Jerusalem in 70 CE, Christians don't flee because Jesus never prophesied the temple's destruction in this timeline. Instead, many Christians fight alongside Jews to defend the sacred site, creating a unity between the two faiths that never existed in our world. The result is a Christianity that develops very differently, more Jewish in practice, more temple-focused in theology, and more connected to the sacrificial system that Jesus came to fulfill rather than replace. Chapter 8. Islam's Different Dawn. When Muhammad receives his first revelation in 610 CE, he looks toward a Jerusalem where Jewish temple worship continues exactly as it did in Moses' time. The night journey that takes him to the farthest mosque brings him to a city where Islamic prayer joins the sound of Jewish sacrificial ceremonies that have echoed for over 12 centuries. The Quran's references to the Jewish people develop differently when they're not scattered in exile, but still living as a nation in their promised land. Instead of criticizing Jews for rejecting their covenant, Islamic revelation focuses on how Muslims can learn from a people who have successfully maintained their relationship with God for so long. Muhammad's meetings with Jewish priests create theological discussions that never happened in our timeline. The priests share ancient traditions about Abraham, Moses, and the prophets that add new dimensions to Islamic understanding. Some Jewish scholars even convert to Islam while continuing their temple duties, creating a unique hybrid tradition. The early Muslim community faces a complex question. How should they relate to Jerusalem when it's not just a holy city, but an active center of Jewish worship? The solution creates a new model where Muslims guard and protect the Jewish temple while building their own places of worship nearby. When Islamic armies expand beyond Arabia, they encounter not scattered Jewish communities, but a powerful Jewish kingdom centered around an intact temple. The military and theological challenges create different patterns of conquest and conversion that reshape how Islam spreads across the ancient world. The three Abrahamic faiths develop a complex relationship around the Temple Mount that involves cooperation, competition, and mutual respect in ways our timeline never experienced. Chapter 9. The Crusades Never Needed. The year 1095 CE arrives, and Pope Urban II stands before a crowd of European nobles, trying to convince them to march to the Holy Land and fight the Muslims. But in this timeline, his message falls flat, because Jerusalem isn't just controlled by Muslims. It's home to a thriving Jewish kingdom with an active temple that has operated continuously for over 16 centuries. The crusading ideal never develops the same power because Christians can't claim that the Holy Land needs liberation from infidels when it's clearly under the protection of the God of Abraham. Jewish kings have maintained control of Jerusalem through diplomacy, military skill, and what can only be described as divine intervention. European pilgrims who travel to Jerusalem find not a conquered city, but a cosmopolitan center where Jews, Christians, and Muslims all worship within sight of each other. The temple sacrifices continue daily, while church bells ring from Christian quarters, and the call to prayer echoes from Muslim neighborhoods. The absence of crusades creates a completely different medieval world. European nobles don't waste their wealth and armies fighting in Palestine, so they focus on expanding trade and developing their own lands. Islamic civilization continues advancing in science and philosophy without the interruption of holy war. The intellectual exchange between Jewish temple scholars, Christian theologians, and Muslim philosophers creates new forms of religious thought that blend monotheistic traditions in unprecedented ways. Universities in Jerusalem become centers of learning that rival Paris, Oxford, and Baghdad. but tensions still simmer beneath the surface. Each faith claims a special connection to the city, and political changes in any of the great empires can upset the delicate balance that has kept peace around the world's most sacred sites. Chapter 10: The Scholarship Revolution. Jewish learning develops along completely different paths when it has an unbroken temple tradition instead of the scattered academies that produce the Talmud in our timeline. The priests who serve in Solomon's temple maintain libraries of ancient texts, astronomical calculations, and mystical knowledge that were lost when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. The continuous operation of temple sacrifices requires precise mathematical calculations for calendar dates, exact measurements for ritual objects, and detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and plant properties. This practical religious science advances Jewish knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy centuries ahead of the surrounding world. Temple scholars develop different methods of interpreting scripture because they can test their theories through actual ritual practice. When they debate the meaning of a sacrifice, they can perform it and observe the results. When they argue about temple architecture, they can examine the actual building that Solomon constructed. The preservation of ancient Hebrew texts in temple archives gives Jewish scholars access to documents that were destroyed in our timeline. These include alternative versions of biblical books, lost prophetic writings, and mystical texts that describe divine mysteries in ways that mainstream Judaism forgot. Medieval Jewish philosophy develops differently when it emerges from temple practice rather than diaspora survival. Instead of Maimonides writing about sacrifice as a theoretical concept, Jewish thinkers explore the actual spiritual mechanics of offerings that they witness daily in the temple courts. The influence spreads beyond Judaism as Christian and Muslim scholars come to Jerusalem to study with temple priests who possess ancient knowledge unavailable anywhere else in the world. The result is a revolution in religious learning that transforms all three monotheistic faiths. Chapter 11: The Secret Scrolls. Deep within the temple's hidden chambers, sealed away in cedar boxes and wrapped in ancient silk, lie scrolls that contain some of the most explosive secrets in human history. These are the texts that were lost when Jerusalem burned in our timeline. Alternative versions of Genesis, lost books of prophecy, and mystical writings that reveal shocking truths about early Jewish beliefs. The priests who guard these scrolls have kept them secret for over 1,000 years, waiting for the right time to reveal knowledge that could shake the foundations of all three monotheistic faiths. Some scrolls contain different versions of the creation story, where multiple divine beings work together to shape the world. Others describe conversations between God and angels that never made it into the canonical Bible. Most dangerous of all are the prophetic texts that predict futures that never came to pass because exile never happened. These scrolls speak of different endings to human history, alternative paths for God's chosen people, and mystical transformations that depend on the temple's continuous operation. One scroll, written in Jeremiah's own hand, describes the vision that convinced God to spare Jerusalem in 586 BCE. but it also warns of a terrible price that will eventually be paid for avoiding exile, a catastrophe in the end times that will be far worse than anything Babylon could have done. The temple priests have debated for centuries whether these secret texts should be revealed or destroyed. Some argue that the knowledge is too dangerous for the world to handle. Others insist that the prophecies must be shared before it's too late to prevent the disasters they describe. As the modern age approaches, the pressure to reveal these ancient secrets becomes impossible to resist. Chapter 12. The Priesthood's Hidden Knowledge. The unbroken chain of temple priests guards secrets that go far beyond hidden scrolls. For over 15 centuries, they have passed down oral traditions that preserve knowledge lost to the rest of the world. The true pronunciation of God's sacred name, the location of sacred objects hidden before various conquests, and mystical practices that connect the physical temple to spiritual realms. The high priests know exactly where the Ark of the Covenant rests within the Holy of Holies, because it has never been moved or lost. They possess the original breastplate with 12 precious stones that light up when God answers their questions. They maintain the sacred fire that has burned continuously on the altar since Solomon first lit it over 1,000 years ago. Most remarkably, they have preserved the ability to communicate directly with God through the Urim and Thummim, sacred objects that provide yes or no answers to questions about Israel's future. This direct divine communication has guided every major decision in Jewish history, from military strategies to diplomatic treaties to religious reforms. The priests also guard practical knowledge that has been lost to modern scholarship. They know the exact architectural plans for the temple, including hidden chambers and secret passages that don't appear in any written records. They understand the acoustic properties that make certain prayers audible throughout the complex and others heard only in heaven. Perhaps most significantly, they maintain the genetic records that trace every priestly family back to Aaron himself. This unbroken genealogical knowledge allows them to verify which modern families have legitimate claims to temple service, information that becomes crucial as the ancient world transitions into the modern age. Chapter 13. The Gospel Contradictions. Hidden in monastery libraries and private collections around the world are early Christian manuscripts that tell a very different story about Jesus' relationship to the temple. These texts were suppressed in our timeline because they contradicted the narrative of temple destruction and Christian replacement, but they survived in a world where the temple never fell. Some of these alternative gospels describe Jesus not as opposing the temple system, but as its ultimate fulfillment. They portray him performing priestly functions, offering sacrifices according to the law of Moses, and teaching that his death was the final sacrifice that made all future offerings meaningful rather than unnecessary. One manuscript, discovered in a sealed jar beneath a Jerusalem church, contains what claims to be Jesus' own words about the temple's eternal purpose. According to this text, Jesus never intended to replace temple worship, but to purify it and restore it to its original spiritual power. Another controversial document describes meetings between the Apostle Paul and temple priests who accepted Jesus as the Messiah while continuing their sacrificial duties. These Judeo-Christian priests developed a theology that combined faith in Jesus with ongoing temple worship in ways that mainstream Christianity rejected. The most explosive text of all claims to be a letter from Jesus himself to the high priest, written after the resurrection, explaining how Christian believers should relate to ongoing temple sacrifices. Church leaders have fought for centuries to keep this document secret because it challenges fundamental Christian doctrines about the relationship between law and grace. As scholars gain access to these hidden texts, they reveal a form of early Christianity that was far more Jewish than anyone imagined, and far more compatible with ongoing temple worship. Chapter 14. The Islamic Mysteries. In the great libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba rest Islamic manuscripts that preserve traditions about the Jewish temple that exist nowhere else in historical records. These texts describe meetings between Muhammad and temple priests, alternative accounts of biblical stories learned from Jewish sources, and prophecies about Islam's role in protecting the temple until the end of days. One collection of hadiths claims that Muhammad himself visited the temple during his night journey to Jerusalem and received teachings from the high priest about the mystical meaning of sacrifice. According to these traditions, the prophet learned secret knowledge about the connection between earthly offerings and heavenly realities that influenced his understanding of Islamic prayer. Islamic scholars preserve different versions of stories about Abraham, Moses, and Solomon that they learned from Jewish priests who had access to temple archives. These accounts sometimes contradict both biblical and Quranic narratives, suggesting that the priests possessed alternative traditions about the patriarchs that were lost when Jerusalem fell in our timeline. Most intriguingly, some Islamic texts contain prophecies about the temple's role in the end times that differ dramatically from both Jewish and Christian expectations. These prophecies describe a final age when Muslims will serve as guardians of the temple, while Jews perform the sacrifices and Christians witness the fulfillment of their Messiah's return. The manuscripts also reveal the development of Islamic law regarding temple worship, detailed regulations about how Muslims should behave when visiting the temple complex, whether they can participate in certain ceremonies, and how Islamic prayer should be conducted in proximity to Jewish sacrificial worship. Chapter 15. The Forbidden Archaeology. Beneath the streets of Jerusalem lie archaeological treasures that have been preserved by continuous Jewish occupation for over 2 millennia. Unlike our timeline, where conquests, destructions, and rebuilding buried or destroyed ancient artifacts, this Jerusalem has maintained unbroken access to sites and objects from the earliest periods of Jewish history. Archaeological excavations around the temple have uncovered inscriptions that reveal shocking details about pre-exile Jewish beliefs and practices. Stone tablets describe rituals that were lost when the priesthood was interrupted, and they mention divine names and mystical concepts that don't appear in any surviving biblical texts. Most controversial, are the artifacts that suggest early Jewish religion was more complex than traditional monotheism. Ancient inscriptions refer to multiple divine beings working together, describe God in both masculine and feminine terms, and mention spiritual practices that mainstream Judaism abandoned or forgot. The continuous operation of the temple has also preserved ritual objects that archaeologists in our timeline can only guess about. The actual instruments used for sacrifice, the original priestly garments with their mystical decorations, and the temple vessels made according to divine specifications provide physical evidence for biblical descriptions that scholars previously thought might be exaggerated. Perhaps most significantly, the preserved temple archives contain detailed records of every major event in Jewish history, from Solomon's time to the present. These documents provide eyewitness accounts of biblical events, genealogical records of every important Jewish family, and detailed descriptions of how Jewish law and practice evolved over the centuries. The archaeological evidence challenges many assumptions about ancient Judaism while confirming others, forcing scholars to completely reconsider what they thought they knew about the development of monotheistic religion. Chapter 16: The World Without Anti-Semitism. In our timeline, anti-Semitism developed from the toxic combination of Jewish exile, Christian theology about deicide, economic resentment against minority communities, and racial theories about Jewish difference. But what happens to anti-Semitism in a world where Jews never experienced exile and maintained their own powerful kingdom centered around an active temple? Without diaspora, Jews never became the scattered minority that could be blamed for economic problems in multiple countries. Without the destruction of the temple, Christian theology never developed the replacement narrative that portrayed Jews as rejected by God. Without statelessness, Jews never became the convenient scapegoat for nationalist movements seeking internal enemies. The Jewish kingdom's continuous existence as a military and diplomatic power meant that persecuting Jews carried real political consequences. European rulers who mistreated Jewish merchants or pilgrims faced retaliation from a kingdom that controlled vital trade routes and maintained alliances with both Christian and Muslim empires. The result is a world where anti-Semitism exists, but never reaches the systematic, genocidal levels it achieved in our timeline. Local prejudices and religious tensions certainly occur, but they're contained by the reality of Jewish political power and the respect that comes from maintaining an unbroken religious tradition for over 2 millennia. Without the Holocaust, World War II develops along different lines, focusing more on ideological conflicts between fascism, communism, and democracy rather than racial genocide. The absence of systematic Jewish persecution changes European politics, American immigration patterns, and the entire development of international human rights law. But this alternative history raises troubling questions. Was persecution necessary for Jews to develop their distinctive values of education, social justice, and universal human dignity? Did suffering create spiritual insights that comfort and security could never produce? Chapter 17: The Technology Temple. Modern Jerusalem. in this timeline presents an extraordinary sight. Ancient temple rituals performed with cutting-edge technology that enhances rather than replaces traditional worship. Genetic testing now verifies which families carry authentic priestly DNA, going back to Aaron himself. Computer analysis helps scholars decode ancient texts that were previously impossible to read. The temple complex now includes climate-controlled archives, where ancient scrolls are preserved using the latest conservation techniques. Digital databases catalog every artifact, every genealogy, and every ritual object that has accumulated over 2,000 years of continuous operation. Virtual reality technology allows Jews around the world to participate in temple services remotely, watching high-definition broadcasts of sacrificial ceremonies and feeling connected to Jerusalem even when they live thousands of miles away. Artificial intelligence helps translate ancient Hebrew texts and identify patterns in prophetic literature that human scholars never noticed. But the integration of technology with ancient religion creates unprecedented theological questions. Can a sacrifice performed with genetically verified priests and digitally monitored procedures carry the same spiritual power as the simple offerings of ancient times? Does global participation through virtual reality fulfill the biblical requirement to appear before God in Jerusalem? Modern Israeli security services use advanced surveillance to protect the temple from terrorist threats while respecting the sacred nature of the site. Biotechnology helps breed perfect sacrificial animals according to biblical specifications. Archaeological robots explore sealed chambers beneath the temple without disturbing their sacred contents. The result is a unique fusion of ancient and modern that exists nowhere else on Earth. A 3,000-year-old religious tradition enhanced by 21st century technology. Chapter 18: The Political Powder Keg. Today's Middle East, with a functioning Jewish temple, creates political dynamics that our timeline never experienced. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict takes entirely different forms when it involves not just competing claims to land, but disputes over access to the world's most sacred religious site. Palestinian Muslims demand prayer rights at the temple complex, while Jewish authorities insist that Islamic presence would contaminate the sacred space. Christian pilgrims want access to sites connected to Jesus' ministry, while temple priests worry about mixing different religious practices in the same location. International diplomacy revolves around protecting what UNESCO declares a World Heritage Site of supreme religious significance. The United Nations maintains a permanent peacekeeping force in Jerusalem, while religious leaders from all three faiths negotiate complex protocols for sharing access to the Temple Mount. The temple's existence changes global Jewish identity in profound ways. Diaspora communities debate whether they should emigrate to Israel to be closer to the temple, or whether Jewish life can be equally meaningful in other countries. Orthodox, conservative, and reform movements split over questions about temple practices that they never had to consider in our timeline. Modern Israel's relationship with its neighbors develops differently when the country possesses not just military strength, but also the world's oldest continuously operating religious institution. Some Arab nations respect Israel's ancient religious heritage, while others see the temple as a symbol of permanent Jewish occupation of Muslim lands. The threat of terrorism against the temple creates global security concerns that go far beyond Middle Eastern politics. An attack on the temple would trigger religious violence worldwide and potentially spark a war between civilizations that could destroy much of what humanity has built. Chapter 19: The Price of Paradise. As we reach the end of our journey through this alternative timeline, we must ask ourselves a profound question. Would an Israel that never experienced exile have developed the same depth of faith, wisdom, and moral insight that has made Judaism such a transformative force in human civilization? In our timeline, the trauma of exile forced Jews to develop portable forms of faith that could survive anywhere. Persecution taught them to value education above material wealth because knowledge couldn't be confiscated. Minority status made them champions of universal human rights because they knew what it meant to be powerless and oppressed. The Jews of exile created the Talmud through centuries of debate in foreign academies. They produced philosophers like Maimonides, who synthesized Jewish thought with world cultures. They developed ethical systems that emphasized justice, compassion, and repair of the world because they had experienced brokenness themselves. But the Jews of this alternative timeline, secure in their temple and their land, might never have developed these distinctive contributions to human civilization. Comfort and continuity could have produced a more insular, less intellectually adventurous Judaism that enriched itself, but not the wider world. Perhaps the deepest question is theological. Did God intend the exile as a necessary part of his plan for both the Jewish people and humanity as a whole? Were the sufferings of diaspora the price that had to be paid for Judaism's ultimate gift to the world, the vision of universal human dignity and divine justice? The Jews who never experienced exile might have been happier, but would they have been the same people who gave the world ethical monotheism, social justice, and the dream of universal peace? Chapter 20: The Prophet's Final Warning. As our exploration of this alternative timeline draws to a close, archaeologists working in the deepest chambers beneath the temple make a discovery that changes everything. Hidden behind a wall that has been sealed for over 2 millennia, they find a scroll written in Jeremiah's own handwriting, a prophecy that was never meant to be opened until the end times. The scroll describes exactly what we have witnessed: a timeline where Israel never went into exile, where the temple never fell, and where Jewish history followed a completely different path. But Jeremiah's final prophecy contains a terrifying warning about the price that would eventually be paid for avoiding God's original plan. According to the ancient text, the exile was meant to scatter the Jewish people across the world so they could be witnesses of God's truth to all nations. By avoiding exile, they failed to fulfill their mission as a light unto the nations. The scroll warns that this failure will result in a catastrophe far worse than anything Babylon could have inflicted. a final judgment that will come when the world needs Jewish witness the most. The prophecy describes signs that match our modern world exactly: global communication that connects all nations, weapons that can destroy entire civilizations, and a generation that has forgotten the lessons of suffering and persecution. According to Jeremiah's vision, the timeline where Israel never went into exile was always destined to merge with our timeline at the moment when humanity faces its greatest crisis. The scroll's final words are chilling. In the day when all nations gather against Jerusalem, when the temple that was preserved becomes the prize that destroys the world, then shall the two paths become one, and the exile that was avoided shall come upon all the earth. As archaeologists translate these ancient warnings, news reports describe rising tensions around the Temple Mount, international conflicts that seem to center on Jerusalem, and a growing sense that humanity is approaching some kind of ultimate crisis. The question that haunts everyone who reads Jeremiah's final prophecy is simple but terrifying. Are we living in the moment when these two timelines converge? And if so, what happens next?